Welcome to the Humble Servant Podcast with Eric Velez. This is the show where we help men and women in public service transition to a career in the private sector. I'm your host, Jody Mayberry, and I am so happy to introduce you to Eric Velez. Hello, Eric.
Hey, Jody, how are you?
I am wonderful, and I'm so excited to be doing the Humble Servant Podcast with you. But let's start with a little bit about you. Who is Eric Velez?
Sure. Thanks, Jody. Yeah, I'm extremely excited about it as well. This has been a long time in the making, but to be able to get this done today is super exciting for me. But yeah, so I'm Eric Velez. I'm a public servant myself. I like to consider myself a public servant. Actually, public service runs in my DNA. My father was a police officer in the military police in the U.S. Army. My grandfather was a mounted police officer and then a detective in the police of Puerto Rico. And then I had the honor of serving 31 years in the FBI.
That's quite a background. I mean, yours, 31 years in the FBI, that alone is pretty amazing. But then to look at your father, your grandfather, that's quite a track record of public service in your family.
Yeah, it's definitely something to be proud of. And I know it's something that many of our listeners share. When you're a police officer, a firefighter in the military, just looking up to your mom and dad and wanting to follow in their footsteps is something that's pretty common in the field of public service.
Well, I spent 8 years as a park ranger, no match to your 31 years in the FBI, but I knew several park rangers whose father or mother had been a park ranger, and their love for what growing up in that park lifestyle and their admiration for their parent is what led them to become a public servant.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, so we touched on it just lightly. 31 years in the FBI. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so my story is actually, it's literally the from the mailroom to the boardroom kind of story. I started in the FBI when I was 19 years old. I was in Puerto Rico, and my father had retired from the Army and joined the Bureau, and they were hiring. And I remember my dad came into the house one day and said, "Hey, do you want to work for the FBI?" And at the time I was just starting college, and I said, "Wow, that sounds pretty neat." And then he says, "Yeah, they pay $11,000 a year." It was a GS3, so it was somewhere around, it was less than 12,000. I was like, 11,000 to me, that just seemed like such a lot of money. So I said, absolutely. So from there, I joined the Bureau. I was a mail clerk. I actually was working a night shift, the graveyard shift, and then going to college during the day and then going to work at night, that type of a thing. But my dream was, it didn't start off this way, but as soon as I got in the Bureau, I wanted to be an FBI agent. It was something, again, I could be part of a law enforcement family, a tradition, carrying on a tradition. So in 1992, I went into Quantico and became an FBI agent. And I served as an FBI agent for 24 years. I worked my way through the organization, working different types of cases and so on, and then got into management. And ultimately, I had the honor of serving as the FBI's head of intelligence. For those in the military, it's kind of the equivalent of a G3 or J3.
So the head of intelligence for the FBI, that's pretty incredible. And even more incredible to know you started out at such a low level at age 19 and worked your way up. That's like a story ran out of a Disney movie.
Yeah. And I can't wait to share some more of that story with all the listeners in the upcoming episodes. But yeah, so that's a really good transition to the story of my Disney career, moving into Disney as well.
Well, that's right. So Eric left the FBI, went to Disney. Eric, was that an easy transition after so many years as a public servant?
Yeah, to be honest with you, the honest answer is no. It's not an easy transition. Well, first I want to say the fact that I got to fulfill a lifelong dream of working for the Walt Disney Company. I mean, I can't even say enough about that. And that's a whole story in itself of how that came about. But when I retired from the Bureau, when you're a federal agent, you have kind of a retirement window. You're eligible at the age of 50, then you're mandatory at the age of 57. So somewhere between 50 and 57, you're going to be leaving the FBI. And one of the hardest things for me about leaving the FBI was, how am I going to replace this type of job that I was doing, in which I get to serve my country. I get to work for this incredible organization. I get to give back. how's that going? How am I going to get that type of joy and passion? Well, Disney, I'm telling you, it's a company that just gives you so much joy and passion because you don't really leave public service. See, I went into Disney as head of security for their parks, their resorts, their ships, and their stores. And what I got to do there was work with this incredible team of men and women. And then we protected the magic. We protected a way of American life, making sure that our children were able to go to those parks and enjoy everything without the fear of anything happening to them. So I got to experience public service in the government, then I got to experience it at Disney as well.
Eric, you mentioned that the transition wasn't easy, even though you ended up at such a great company like Disney. And I know you want to talk about it more on a future episode, but can you give us a little more insight into why it wasn't easy to transition from the FBI to the private sector?
Yeah, sure, Jody. So when I say it wasn't easy, what I was referring to is the fact that, when you spend so many years, I spent 31 years in the FBI, and you learn a whole culture. There's a strong culture in law enforcement, and there's a very strong culture in the FBI. Moving into a company like Disney, where the culture there is very strong as well, takes time to learn things as simple as the way you speak and the way you call things. For example, the way we would refer to budgeting versus AOP, things like that. So it's not easy because there's a lot of times you start to kind of question yourself as, shouldn't I know that by now? So it's, and in one of the upcoming episodes, I'll talk a little bit about the challenge of the specific challenges in transitioning. But so it was difficult in that sense, just to kind of adapting to a whole new culture.
Okay. So you ended up leaving Disney, and what do you do now?
Yeah. So when I left Disney, one of the reasons I left Disney was while I was at Disney, I was able to pursue this other dream that I had, and that was to get an MBA. At Disney, I was fortunate enough to enroll in an MBA program at the University of Southern California. And from there, this passion grew of wanting to have my own company. And so in November of last year, I left Disney and I joined a small firm based in Washington, D.C., known as Arena Strategic Advisors. I knew the owner and I know him. He's a good friend of mine. And he knew that I was going to be starting my own company. And so coming on board with him was a chance for me to learn a lot about the consulting business. It was a way to transition a little bit easier from a job in which, I had a salary that was coming regularly to where I'm hanging up a shingle and starting my own company. So I spent some time with Arena, and just a couple weeks ago, I decided to actually hang out the shingle and start my own security consulting company. And that's what I do now.
That takes us to the podcast. This is new to you, not only the podcast, but hanging your own shingle. 31 years FBI, 3 years at Disney, and now brand new to yourself. So this is exciting time. And then let's look at the podcast itself. What's the story behind the Humble Servant podcast?
Yeah, so the Humble Servant podcast came about really to kind of take on a challenge, there was a certain challenge going on in the sense that one of the things that I love to do is help other people. And so as I left the FBI, joining Disney, a lot of my former colleagues, these are friends of mine from the Bureau, would call me or send me an email saying, hey, Eric, do you have some time? We can maybe go over my resume, maybe talk a little about, give me some advice of what you think I should be thinking about as they begin their kind of transition. And, I love doing that. If there was a challenge, I just didn't have enough time to do as many as I wanted. A lot of times I would literally get these resumes, and on a plane trip from Disneyland to Disney World, I would actually read these and put my comments down. So I started thinking about how can I do this and scale it where I could help a lot more people. That's when the idea of a podcast came about, for me to be able to share a lot of these tips and this advice that I had been given, to pass that on to others as well.
And what can we expect from the Humble Servant podcast?
There's going to be two types of shows. One will be in which, you and I, Jody, will sit down and we'll talk about things that I've learned along my journey, the mistakes that I have made that I've learned from, as well as things that I did that actually worked pretty well. And there'll be a chance for me to share those with our listeners. And then there's going to be this other style of show in which we're going to bring people on the show and conduct interviews. And the interviews will even be kind of divided into two buckets. One will be interviewing experts in various fields that help with this transition. For example, one of our guests may be talking to our listeners about creating a brand for yourself, or even something as simple as like, what should you be wearing to this interview? And I know there's another podcast that's coming up, another episode in which into an executive, one of the major executive search firms, and how do we use those search firms in order to get this dream job down the road. Then I also want to take an opportunity to create an episode called the episode, and in the spot interviewing somebody who's made this. It may not have been successful in the very first time, but they've learned along the way, and they've got incredible stories to share about things they did that helped them. And now that they're in the private sector, things that our listeners should be thinking about.
I'm excited about this show, Eric. What is your goal with the Humble Servant podcast?
Okay, so this is going to sound crazy because it may not make a lot of sense. My goal, my ultimate goal of this podcast is really to reduce the number of listeners that I have. Now, let me explain that. Of course, I would like lots of people to listen to this and to benefit from this, to be able to share this with as many people as possible really is one of my goals. But when I think about the ultimate goal, I think about it this way. If one of our listeners listens to an episode or various episodes and picks up some really neat tips on how to do an interview, for example, and they land their dream job, and because they have this dream job, now they're focusing on moving their families and transitioning to this company. And they may not see a need to listen to this show anymore, or maybe too busy to listen to the show. And therefore I've lost them as a listener. Then ultimately that's what I want. I want them to get that job. And so if I lose that listener, I think I've accomplished my goal. It sounds crazy, but I hope you can understand that.
Well, I love it. How unique is that to say my goal of this podcast is for you to not listen to it anymore. Now, that's because you have found it so useful, you accomplish your goals and you don't need it, but that's just wonderful. Well, Eric, I'm so glad to be doing this with you, and I can't wait to start the interviews and all the great things coming up.
Yeah, me too, Jody. This is going to be fun. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you for listening to the Humble Servant podcast.